Before anything unfolds, know that nothing sudden will occur here. There will be no sharp turns, no raised voices, no moments that ask you to brace yourself. You are only invited to rest your attention somewhere gentle. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your breathing slow without effort. You are not required to act or decide. You are only a quiet witness, allowed to observe without consequence. What follows moves at its own pace, and it will not hurry you. I belong to a place that does not name itself. Names imply edges, and this land was never shaped with edges in mind. It stretches through stone corridors worn smooth by time that does not measure itself. Light here does not arrive from a single source. It seems to seep from surfaces, from minerals embedded in the walls, from the faint pulse of mechanisms buried so deeply that no one remembers who placed them there. I learned long ago to walk without expectation, because expectation makes the ground feel unsteady. My days once followed patterns so consistent they no longer felt like patterns. Movement, pause, nourishment, rest, observation without interpretation. The world functioned whether I considered it or not, and that was enough. Creatures crossed my path without acknowledging me. Structures hummed softly, maintaining purposes no longer examined. Even the enforcers who moved through the lower corridors followed routes that rarely intersected with mine. I had learned where stillness was permitted. Then something fell into our world. Not gently, not violently either. It arrived the way a wrong note arrives in an otherwise tolerable sound, noticeable not because it was loud, but because it did not belong to the sequence. The air reacted first. It tightened, then released, as if correcting itself. Surfaces near the arrival point carried a residue that resisted immediate classification. I did not see the arrival itself. Few did. We sensed it through alterations. Doors failed to seal properly. Light fluctuated in places where it had never done so before. The smallest organisms retreated from open spaces, not in panic, but in avoidance, as if something unfamiliar had entered the shared understanding of danger. When I first saw the one who arrived, he was not moving. He lay near the edge of a corridor rarely used, his body arranged in a way that suggested collapse rather than rest. His form was unlike ours, but not incomprehensible. Limbs placed with an awkward symmetry. Coverings thin, insufficient for this environment. His breathing was erratic, audible even from a distance. I did not approach immediately. Approach implies intention. Instead, I adjusted my position slightly so that I could remain aware of him without becoming involved. That had always been my method. Observe until observation no longer changes anything. Yet this time, observation altered the space between us. His presence introduced a tension I could not ignore, not sharp, not urgent, but persistent, like a vibration felt through the floor rather than heard. When he moved, it was clumsy. Muscles responded too slowly or too quickly, unsure of the gravity they were negotiating. He struggled to rise, failed, adjusted, tried again. Each movement left faint marks on the surface beneath him, traces of effort that did not fade as quickly as expected. I realized then that this was not a passing anomaly. The world had accepted him, imperfectly. Systems that should have rejected foreign matter did not activate. Barriers that normally restricted passage hesitated, then allowed him through. It was as if the mechanisms governing order were uncertain how to classify him, and uncertainty had created permission. As he began to move deeper into the corridors, I followed at a distance that felt respectful. He did not know I was there. That was important. Awareness would have changed his behavior, and I wanted to understand him unaltered. He stopped often, not from fatigue alone, but from confusion. He examined walls, devices, openings, trying to read intention into structures that no longer remembered their own design. I noticed something unexpected. The environment responded to him differently than it did to us. Some pathways brightened slightly as he approached, as if registering a stimulus long absent. Other areas darkened, withdrawing energy rather than offering it. It was inconsistent, almost curious. At one point, he encountered a barrier that even we avoided, not because it was forbidden, but because it served no purpose anymore. He studied it, placed his hands against its surface, and waited. Nothing happened. He remained there longer than seemed reasonable, breathing slowly, as if listening. Then the barrier shifted. Not fully, just enough. That was when I felt the first change within myself. Not alarm, not wonder. Something quieter. A recalibration, perhaps. I had spent so long assuming the world was finished rearranging itself. Watching him stand there, patient in a way that was not native to this place, suggested otherwise. As he passed through the partially opened barrier, I stayed behind for a moment, observing the altered configuration. The opening remained, small but persistent. The world had learned something new, and it was not in a hurry to forget it. I resumed following him, my steps slower now, measured not by habit but by attention. He moved forward without knowing he was being traced, without knowing that his arrival had already begun to leave subtle impressions that would not be undone. And as the corridors stretched ahead of us, unchanged in form yet altered in meaning, I understood that my role had shifted as well, though I could not yet describe how. He did not move with purpose yet. Purpose comes from familiarity, and nothing here offered him that. His progress was shaped by trial, by the simple act of touching surfaces and waiting for a response. Sometimes the world answered him with resistance. Sometimes it answered with allowance. I watched him learn the difference, slowly, without language. There were moments when he stopped entirely, standing still long enough that the systems around him recalibrated to his presence. Light adjusted. Low mechanical sounds altered their cadence. It was as if the environment was deciding whether to treat him as temporary interference or something that might remain. I had never seen that hesitation before. In one of the larger chambers, the kind once used for collective transit, he encountered others of my kind. They noticed him immediately. Their bodies stiffened, not in fear, but in alert recognition of anomaly. He raised his hands in a gesture that meant nothing here. The response was predictable. Restraint followed. Force applied efficiently, without emotion. I did not intervene. Intervention was not part of my earlier self. I observed as he was taken, as his resistance faded into exhaustion rather than submission. He was moved through corridors I rarely entered, places where stillness was enforced rather than chosen. The world there felt denser, heavier with intention. Time passed differently while he was held. I could sense it through the rhythms of patrol and pause. I adjusted my routines to remain nearby, not out of strategy, but because distance from him began to feel like absence. That realization arrived quietly, without announcement. I did not examine it. Examination would have altered it. When he escaped, it was not through strength. It was through misalignment. A device responded incorrectly. A guard misjudged a threshold. Small errors accumulated until an opening existed where none should have been. He ran without direction, driven by a need that did not require understanding. I followed again, closer this time. He fell more than once. Each fall changed how he rose. Less urgency, more calculation. He began to learn the ground. He learned which surfaces supported his weight, which resisted it. He learned how sound carried differently depending on the structure around him. These lessons did not make him safer. They made him present. At one point, he encountered a creature native to the outer regions, one usually avoided because interaction served no function. The creature approached him cautiously. There was a pause between them, long enough that I expected retreat on both sides. Instead, the creature adjusted its posture, lowering itself slightly. The human mirrored the motion without realizing he was doing so. The exchange passed without conflict. They separated without acknowledgement. Something in that moment shifted the way I perceived boundaries. Not between species, but between roles. Observer and participant no longer felt entirely separate. I was still unseen, still silent, but the act of watching had acquired weight. Later, when he reached the upper structures where the environment opens briefly to the sky, he stopped completely. The light there behaves differently. It does not illuminate. It presses gently against surfaces, revealing texture rather than shape. He stood under it for a long time, breathing evenly now, no longer erratic. I wondered then if he sensed the world beginning to accommodate him, not welcome him. Accommodation is quieter than welcome. It is a rearrangement made without ceremony. As he moved on, I remained behind for a moment, letting the light settle back into its usual patterns. The world resumed its old rhythms, but something had been introduced that those rhythms now accounted for, even in his absence. When I followed again, my steps were no longer guided by routine. They were guided by continuity. I did not know where his path would lead. I only knew that it had already altered mine, not through drama, but through accumulation. And as the corridors narrowed ahead, carrying both of us deeper into structures that predated explanation, the sense of witnessing transformed into something quieter still, something that did not need a name to persist. He began to recognize patterns that were never meant to be recognized. Not because they were hidden, but because no one here had ever needed them. Doors that responded after delay rather than command. Platforms that accepted weight only when it was distributed unevenly. Mechanisms that required stillness instead of force. I could see him hesitate less with each encounter, not because he felt safer, but because hesitation itself was changing shape. It was becoming attentive rather than fearful. I noticed that the structures responded differently when he was injured. Damage to his body altered the way the world behaved around him. Energy conduits dimmed when his movements slowed. Surfaces that had been rigid softened slightly when he leaned against them for support. This was not compassion. It was adaptation. The systems were not designed to care, but they were designed to persist, and persistence sometimes requires adjustment to new variables. I remained just outside his awareness, close enough to register the changes he left behind. The marks of his passage were subtle. A panel left ajar where it had always been sealed. A faint discoloration where his blood had contacted the floor, absorbed slowly rather than rejected. These traces did not alarm anyone else. They did not interrupt routine. But I saw them accumulate, and accumulation changes meaning. There was a period when he was forced to remain in one area longer than usual. Injury had slowed him. He occupied a chamber that had once been used for rest, though rest had not been practiced there for a very long time. He lay against a sloped surface, breathing shallowly at first, then more evenly. His stillness was not the stillness of the dead or the waiting. It was the stillness of recalibration. I stayed nearby, positioned where the light fractured softly across the walls. Watching him breathe became a rhythm that replaced one of my own. I did not mirror it consciously. It simply began to occur. In that space, time did not progress forward so much as it thickened. Each moment added weight to the next without urgency. While he rested, the environment continued to process his presence. Subsystems engaged and disengaged without visible cause. A distant transport mechanism activated briefly, then powered down. I had never seen that sequence occur without instruction. It suggested that something had been triggered and then dismissed, as if the world itself had reconsidered. When he woke, he did so without alarm. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to light that was never meant for them. He remained still for a long time, testing the state of his body through micro-movements rather than action. When he finally rose, it was with care that bordered on respect, not toward the space, but toward the fact that it had allowed him to remain. He resumed movement, slower now, favoring one side. This imbalance altered his interaction with the terrain. He discovered paths that had been irrelevant before, routes that only became viable when approached asymmetrically. Watching him adapt without realizing he was adapting revealed something I had not considered. The world did not require understanding to be navigated. It required presence. At one point, he encountered another of my kind again, one whose role involved enforcement rather than observation. The interaction was brief. Force was applied. He was injured further, but not captured. The enforcer hesitated at a threshold, unwilling or unable to pursue beyond it. That boundary had existed long before the human arrived, but it had never been tested in that way. Now it held significance. As the human moved beyond that line, I felt something detach within me. Not a bond, not an allegiance. A permission, perhaps. The permission to follow beyond the routes I had accepted as sufficient. I crossed the boundary later, alone, without consequence. Nothing prevented me. Nothing acknowledged me either. The lack of response was itself informative. Beyond that point, the structures grew older. Not older in time, but older in intention. They were built for functions that no longer applied, by beings whose assumptions no longer govern this place. The human moved through them carefully, occasionally stopping to rest, occasionally to observe. He began to look outward more than forward, as if the act of seeing had become grounding rather than distracting. I noticed then that I was no longer simply recording his passage. I was anticipating it. I found myself considering where he might pause next, which route would accommodate his condition, where resistance would increase. This anticipation did not influence him. It altered me. My awareness extended ahead of both of us, mapping possibility rather than memory. The world remained indifferent to these internal shifts. That indifference made them possible. Nothing corrected me. Nothing signaled deviation. I continued quietly behind him, through corridors that absorbed sound and chambers that redistributed light, through a place that had not expected either of us to pass through it in this way. And as distance accumulated between where he had been and where he was going, I understood that the changes occurring were not centered on arrival or escape. They were occurring in the sustained act of movement itself, in the way presence, once introduced, continues to reshape what follows without ever announcing that it has done so. As he moved deeper, the environment began to compress around the path he chose. Corridors narrowed not by design but by accumulation, layers of construction placed over older layers, each responding to needs that no longer existed. He adjusted without complaint. His shoulders angled slightly. His steps shortened. He learned to pause before corners, listening not for sound but for the absence of it, the way space reveals itself when nothing occupies it. I noticed that my distance from him stabilized. I was neither gaining nor falling behind. This equilibrium felt unfamiliar. Before, movement had always been solitary or cyclical. Now it was relational, even if the relation remained unacknowledged. I adjusted my pace not to match his speed, but to maintain continuity. That distinction mattered, though I could not yet explain why. There were regions where the architecture opened unexpectedly, vast interior spaces held up by supports too thin to justify their function. In these areas, gravity behaved with slight inconsistency. He felt it immediately, compensating through instinct rather than calculation. His body learned what the world required before his thoughts could interfere. Watching this process unfold revealed how much of existence here had become abstract to us, reduced to routine rather than engagement. At the edge of one such chamber, he stopped again. Not from fatigue. Something had drawn his attention upward. The ceiling there was incomplete, fractured by age or design, allowing a muted version of the outer atmosphere to seep in. The light carried particulate matter, slow-moving, almost deliberate. He watched it descend for a long time. His breathing slowed further. I sensed that this observation was not passive. It was grounding him, anchoring his awareness to the fact that this place, however hostile, was still governed by continuity. I realized then that he was not simply surviving. He was integrating, not into our society, which had not invited him, but into the environment itself. The distinction mattered. Societies resist change. Environments absorb it. There was a moment when he slipped. Not dramatically. His foot lost purchase on a surface that had once been stable. He fell against a structural support and remained there, unmoving, until the pain subsided enough for him to reassess. I waited, not because I could assist, but because leaving felt incorrect. That was new. Previously, correctness had been defined by efficiency. Now it was being defined by presence. When he resumed, his movement incorporated the memory of the fall. He avoided similar surfaces. He tested with weight before committing. These adaptations were quiet, incremental. They did not announce progress. They accumulated silently, the way layers form in sediment. Eventually, he reached a junction where pathways diverged in ways that defied obvious logic. One route descended sharply, disappearing into shadow dense enough to resist illumination. Another ascended through a series of platforms that appeared unstable, their surfaces irregular and incomplete. A third path curved gently, offering no immediate obstacle but no visible destination either. He stood there for a long time, not deciding, simply existing at the convergence of options. I sensed that this moment was not about choice. It was about recognition. He was learning that movement here was not about selecting the correct path, but about accepting the consequences of whichever path was taken. He chose the gentle curve. I felt no surprise. That path did not promise ease, only continuity. It allowed him to remain present rather than reactive. I followed, noting how the curve subtly altered orientation, how it disoriented without displacing. The world shifted around us, not abruptly, but gradually, enough that the change registered only after it had already occurred. As we progressed, I became aware of changes in myself that were no longer subtle. My perception of time had altered. It no longer felt like a resource to be managed, but a medium to move through. I found myself recalling earlier states not with nostalgia, but with distance, as if they belonged to a version of me that had already completed its function. There came a point where the human paused and placed his hand against a surface marked by inscriptions too worn to interpret. The markings were not language, at least not in a form still active. They were records of intention rather than instruction. He traced them without understanding, his fingers following grooves shaped by others long gone. That contact lingered. The surface responded with a faint change in temperature, a delayed reaction that suggested dormant systems stirring briefly. I felt something settle then, an internal adjustment that did not ask permission. The act of witnessing had shifted again. I was no longer observing an anomaly moving through a static world. I was observing a world revealing itself differently because of sustained presence. The distinction was irreversible. He withdrew his hand and continued forward, unaware that the contact had altered anything beyond himself. The markings dimmed slowly, returning to dormancy, but not entirely. A trace remained, not visible, but active enough to influence future interactions, however minor. I followed, carrying with me the understanding that this passage was not transient. Even if he were to leave this place entirely, the configurations he had activated would persist, subtle and uncelebrated, woven into the ongoing function of a world that rarely acknowledged change but nonetheless depended on it. And as the path ahead narrowed once more, guiding us into regions where even memory struggled to maintain coherence, I accepted without resistance that my role had transformed beyond observation alone. Not into intervention, not into guidance, but into continuity itself, the quiet act of remaining present as movement reshaped both traveler and terrain without ever announcing its intent. The region beyond the narrowing corridor did not announce itself as different. Difference here was cumulative, not declarative. The air carried a slightly altered density, enough that movement required marginally more effort, enough that breathing adjusted without conscious command. The human noticed it only after several steps, his chest rising a fraction deeper, his pace slowing by degrees too small to register as hesitation. I registered it immediately, not because my senses were sharper, but because I had learned to attend to variation rather than function. Structures in this area were less coherent. Walls intersected at angles that suggested revisions rather than design. Surfaces bore evidence of having been repurposed repeatedly, layers of material laid over previous layers without removal, as if the act of erasure had become impractical or undesirable. The human's hand brushed against one such surface as he passed, flakes of brittle residue falling away at the contact. He paused, examined the material, then wiped his fingers against his clothing with a quiet gesture of distaste that carried no judgment, only reflex. I followed, noting how the environment no longer reacted to him as distinctly as before. Earlier, his presence had caused visible adjustment. Here, the world seemed accustomed to irregularity. It absorbed him without comment. That absorption altered the tone of his movement. He became less cautious, not because danger had lessened, but because the signals he relied on to assess threat had blurred. He moved forward with a steadiness that suggested resignation had transformed into orientation. There were sounds here that did not originate from machinery. Low, continuous vibrations traveled through the structures, irregular in pattern, resistant to interpretation. They were not warnings. They were not messages. They were processes continuing without regard for observers. The human paused several times, placing his hand against the wall, feeling the vibration through bone rather than skin. Each time, he remained a little longer, as if testing whether attention itself could extract meaning. It could not, but the act of attending seemed to settle him regardless. I became aware that I was no longer mapping his path against my previous understanding of the world. That framework had lost relevance. Instead, I found myself constructing a new internal geography, one defined by where he slowed, where he rested, where the environment offered marginal accommodation. This geography was not transferable. It existed only in relation to his presence, and by extension, to mine. At one point, the corridor opened into a space that resisted categorization entirely. It was neither chamber nor passage, neither enclosed nor exposed. The boundaries were implied rather than constructed, defined by shifts in texture and light rather than walls. The human entered cautiously, then stopped, his posture changing in a way I had not seen before. His shoulders lowered, not in fatigue, but in release. He sat on the ground without apparent calculation, his back against nothing solid, trusting balance rather than support. I did not remain standing. That choice surprised me. I lowered myself as well, occupying a position just outside his peripheral awareness. The ground here was cool, uneven, embedded with fragments of older structures that pressed against my form. The vibrations were more pronounced, resonating through contact rather than air. For a time, neither of us moved. This pause did not feel like waiting. It felt like a recalibration point, a place where forward movement temporarily lost relevance. The human closed his eyes. His breathing deepened further, no longer compensating for injury or environment, but aligning with it. I sensed that this alignment was not surrender. It was an adjustment of scale, a narrowing of focus to what could be sustained rather than what could be achieved. While he rested, the space around us continued its processes. Light shifted subtly, not cycling, not pulsing, but drifting in response to mechanisms too distant to locate. Particulate matter settled, then rose again, caught in currents that did not repeat. The vibrations altered frequency, briefly aligning into something almost rhythmic before dispersing again into irregularity. None of this responded to our presence. That indifference was stabilizing. When the human opened his eyes again, there was no urgency in the movement. He remained seated, observing without scanning, allowing his gaze to rest rather than search. I realized then that he was no longer moving through this world as an intruder. He was moving as a temporary resident, aware of his impermanence but no longer defined by it. Eventually, he rose. The act was slower than before, but more assured. He adjusted his stance, tested his balance, then proceeded toward an exit that was not immediately obvious. I watched him choose direction based not on visibility or apparent safety, but on subtle cues: airflow, resonance underfoot, the way light fractured along edges. These cues had always existed. He had learned how to read them without instruction. As I followed, I felt the weight of an earlier identity loosen further. The role I had occupied before his arrival, observer within a static system, no longer fit the conditions that now prevailed. I was still unseen. I still did not intervene. But the act of accompanying had acquired substance. It was no longer passive. The path ahead inclined gently, leading toward structures that carried a different quality of age, not older or newer, but less resolved. The materials there seemed provisional, as if awaiting a final configuration that never arrived. The human moved toward them without apprehension. His presence did not resolve the uncertainty embedded in those forms, but it interacted with it, creating momentary alignments that allowed passage. I followed into that unresolved space, aware that whatever lay ahead would not restore previous equilibria. The world had already adjusted too many times, quietly, incrementally, in response to sustained presence. There would be no return to an earlier state, not for him, not for me, not for the systems that now accounted for variables they had never anticipated. And so movement continued, not toward resolution, not toward escape, but forward in the only way that remained meaningful, through continued contact, continued adjustment, and the unspoken understanding that what persists does so not by resisting change, but by absorbing it until change becomes indistinguishable from structure itself. The incline did not lead upward in any conventional sense. Elevation here was not measured by distance from ground, but by shifts in pressure and exposure. As the human advanced, the air thinned slightly, not enough to distress him, but enough to alter the sound of his movement. Footsteps lost their depth. Breathing sounded closer, more immediate, as if the space itself were drawing nearer. The structures along this path bore fewer signs of maintenance. Surfaces were intact but unattended, functioning without oversight. Devices embedded in the walls emitted low, steady outputs without variation, their purpose no longer adaptive, only persistent. The human passed them without inspection. Earlier, he would have paused, tested, attempted to understand. Now, he accepted their presence without engagement. This was not indifference. It was discernment shaped by experience. I followed, aware that my own attention had begun to mirror his. Where once I catalogued anomalies, I now registered continuity. The world was no longer a system to be observed, but a medium being traversed. That shift altered how I perceived my own form within it. I no longer felt anchored to specific locations. Movement itself had become my reference point. There was a section where the path narrowed to the point that contact with the walls was unavoidable. The human adjusted his posture instinctively, turning slightly, distributing pressure to minimize friction. The walls responded with faint thermal changes, warming where contact occurred, cooling slowly after he passed. This response was delayed, almost hesitant, as if the material were learning to register interaction again after a long period of irrelevance. I noticed then that the environment's reactions were no longer inconsistent. They were subtle, but patterned. The world had begun to anticipate him, not in specific terms, but in principle. Systems adjusted not because he triggered them, but because his continued presence had altered baseline expectations. This realization settled within me without resistance. It explained changes I had felt but not articulated. Beyond the narrow passage, the space opened into an area defined less by construction and more by absence. Large sections of the floor were missing, not collapsed, but deliberately removed, revealing layers beneath that were never meant to be visible. The human approached the edge cautiously, peering down into depths that did not offer immediate comprehension. He did not attempt to measure the distance. He only assessed whether crossing was possible. The crossing required balance rather than strength. Narrow supports spanned the gaps, irregular in placement, their surfaces worn smooth by time rather than use. He tested each before committing weight, adjusting after every step. I remained behind, watching the sequence of micro-decisions that allowed him to progress. There was no hesitation born of fear. There was only evaluation. As he crossed, I became aware of a change in my own internal orientation. I no longer perceived myself as separate from the sequence unfolding ahead. His movement created a temporal structure that I inhabited as well, each step a marker that defined where attention should rest. The gap between observer and observed had thinned, not through proximity, but through alignment of pace. When he reached the far side, he paused, not to recover, but to recalibrate his awareness. He looked back once, not searching, not expecting. The glance was brief, almost reflexive, but it carried weight. For the first time, I felt exposed, not physically, but conceptually. The possibility that he might sense something beyond himself, something accompanying rather than obstructing, introduced a new variable. It passed quickly. He turned forward again and continued. The path ahead descended slightly, leading into an area where the architecture shifted once more. Here, the structures were modular, composed of repeating units arranged without apparent hierarchy. Each unit functioned independently, yet contributed to a larger, loosely coherent whole. The human moved through them with increasing confidence, recognizing the repetition not as monotony, but as predictability. I reflected then on how my earlier existence had been defined by fixed routes and known boundaries. That framework had provided stability, but it had also limited perception. Accompanying him through spaces that resisted categorization had expanded my understanding of what stability could mean. It was no longer tied to permanence. It was tied to adaptability. There came a point where the human slowed again, not due to injury or obstacle, but because something ahead altered the quality of the space. The air carried a faint electrical presence, not strong enough to be dangerous, but enough to raise awareness. The light here fractured differently, casting no clear shadows, only gradients. He proceeded carefully, each step deliberate, his senses attuned to shifts that could not be named. I sensed that we were approaching a threshold, not a boundary that prevented passage, but one that altered conditions irreversibly. The human did not know this. He could not. But his body responded nonetheless, tension redistributing, focus narrowing. I followed, aware that crossing this point would further distance both of us from any previous state that might have been considered normal. As we moved forward, I accepted that whatever lay ahead would not resolve the uncertainties that had accumulated. Resolution was not the function of this journey. Continuation was. The world had adjusted to that principle, and so had I. The act of remaining present, of moving alongside without interference, had become sufficient. The structures ahead awaited contact, not with expectation, but with readiness shaped by prior adjustment. The human stepped into that readiness without ceremony, carrying with him the quiet weight of sustained presence. I followed, no longer questioning the nature of my role, only honoring its persistence as the environment continued to reshape itself around the simple, ongoing fact of movement. Beyond the threshold, the environment did not transform abruptly. There was no clear demarcation to signal that something fundamental had shifted. Instead, the sensation arrived through absence. The faint electrical tension dissipated, replaced by a neutrality that felt almost deliberate. The human paused instinctively, his body registering the change before his thoughts could assign meaning to it. He took one careful step, then another, confirming that the ground still responded as expected, that gravity remained consistent enough to trust. The structures here were arranged with a restraint I had not encountered before. Surfaces were smoother, not from wear, but from intention. Lines were uninterrupted, intersections softened rather than reinforced. The architecture did not assert purpose. It accommodated movement without directing it. The human adjusted quickly, his posture relaxing slightly, his steps becoming more fluid. I sensed that he felt less observed here, though no one watched him openly. I followed, aware that my own perception was shifting in parallel. In earlier regions, I had measured change by disruption. Here, change expressed itself through ease. The world no longer resisted or adapted visibly. It simply allowed. That allowance carried weight. It suggested that whatever processes governed this area had reached a state where variation was no longer treated as anomaly, but as baseline. The human moved through a sequence of spaces that blended into one another without clear separation. Each area differed subtly in texture, in light diffusion, in acoustic response, but none demanded attention. He stopped less frequently now, conserving energy without consciously doing so. His movements had acquired a quiet efficiency, shaped by accumulated experience rather than strategy. At one point, he encountered a shallow basin filled with a translucent substance that reflected light unevenly. He knelt beside it, touching the surface with the tips of his fingers. The substance reacted slowly, rippling outward with a delay that suggested viscosity beyond appearance. He withdrew his hand, examined the residue left behind, then wiped it away with care. The interaction left no visible mark, yet the basin's surface did not fully return to stillness for some time. I observed this with a sense of recognition. Not recognition of function, but of pattern. The world here responded to contact not by rejecting or absorbing, but by remembering briefly. That memory did not persist in a way that altered structure, but it influenced immediate behavior. I realized that this was how the environment had begun to treat the human as well. Not as an intrusion to be corrected, but as a variable to be registered temporarily, without permanence or dismissal. As he continued, the light shifted gradually, not dimming or brightening, but changing temperature. Cooler tones gave way to warmer ones, not enough to comfort, but enough to soften contrast. Shadows lost definition, blending gently into surrounding surfaces. The human silhouette became less distinct against the background, his form no longer standing out as sharply as before. This visual integration seemed to ease him. He moved without scanning his surroundings as aggressively, trusting that abrupt threats were less likely here. I felt my own outline blur in response, not physically, but conceptually. I had always understood myself in relation to fixed reference points. Here, reference dissolved into continuity. I was present, but presence no longer required distinction. The act of accompanying had become diffuse, spread across perception rather than anchored to position. There was a prolonged stretch where nothing obstructed his path. No barriers, no hazards, no decisions demanding immediate response. This absence did not accelerate him. Instead, it slowed him further, as if ease itself encouraged restraint. He walked at a pace that balanced progress with awareness, neither rushing nor lingering. I matched this pace without effort, no longer adjusting consciously. During this interval, I became aware of internal changes that had progressed beyond subtlety. My earlier inclination to catalog, to interpret, to anticipate outcomes had diminished. In its place was a form of attentiveness that did not seek resolution. I was not waiting for an event to justify my presence. Presence had become self-sustaining. Eventually, the environment introduced variation again, not through obstacle, but through invitation. A series of openings appeared along one side of the passage, each leading into spaces that hinted at different conditions. The human slowed, glancing into each briefly without entering. He did not appear tempted. His evaluation was swift, intuitive. He continued along the main path, accepting continuity over divergence. I recognized this as a shift in his orientation toward possibility. Earlier, each branching path represented potential survival or escape. Now, divergence represented disruption to an equilibrium he had learned to maintain. This was not complacency. It was calibration. He had found a rhythm that sustained him, and he guarded it without conscious effort. As we moved on, I noticed that the world's responses to him had grown increasingly subtle. Systems no longer adjusted overtly. Instead, they maintained a flexibility that accommodated his presence without signaling it. This invisibility of adaptation suggested maturity, not age, but experiential maturity. The environment had learned enough from prior interactions to no longer require active recalibration. I felt a corresponding maturation within myself. The internal shifts that had once felt tentative now felt settled. I no longer questioned whether accompanying him was deviation or error. The concept of deviation had lost relevance. What existed now was a continuous state shaped by mutual influence, even if that influence remained asymmetrical and unacknowledged. Ahead, the path extended without clear indication of destination. There were no markers to suggest arrival or departure, no signs of culmination. The human proceeded without expectation, his movement steady, his awareness contained. I followed, not anticipating resolution, not seeking closure, but accepting that continuation itself had become the defining structure of this passage. The world accommodated this acceptance without response, its processes unfolding quietly around us. And within that quiet unfolding, both of us persisted, shaped not by purpose or destination, but by the sustained, unremarkable act of moving forward together through a space that no longer needed to explain itself. The continuation unfolded without announcement. The space did not change its tone, yet the human's interaction with it grew increasingly economical. He no longer reached out to test surfaces unless a shift in texture or light suggested uncertainty. His hands remained closer to his body, conserving warmth and energy, his movements guided by an internal calibration refined through repetition rather than conscious decision. I observed how each step now carried memory, not as recollection, but as embodied adjustment. The path curved again, subtly, enough that orientation shifted without displacing direction. This curvature altered how sound traveled. Footsteps echoed briefly, then dissolved into the ambient resonance that permeated this region. The human noticed the change immediately. His pace slowed by a fraction, his breathing aligning with the new acoustic profile. He was listening, not for threat, but for coherence, for confirmation that the environment remained internally consistent. I followed, attuned to a quieter layer of interaction. The systems here no longer responded directly to presence. Instead, they maintained a state of readiness that absorbed variation without expression. This readiness was not passive. It was the product of accumulated interaction, the environment's way of remaining functional without needing to distinguish between expected and unexpected inputs. The human had become one such input, integrated without ceremony. There came a stretch where the floor inclined unevenly, not enough to disrupt balance, but enough to require continuous adjustment. The human compensated instinctively, redistributing weight with each step. His injury, once a defining limitation, had become a background condition, accounted for rather than confronted. I noted how this shift altered his posture. Pain no longer dictated movement. Movement accommodated pain. This accommodation resonated within me. I recognized a parallel transformation in my own internal state. Earlier, the presence of the human had introduced disruption, a variable that demanded attention. Now, that presence had become part of my baseline perception. I no longer experienced his movement as deviation. It was simply one of the processes unfolding within the environment, no more or less significant than the vibrations in the walls or the drift of particulate matter through light. The corridor widened gradually, offering peripheral space without directing use. The human glanced to either side briefly, then continued forward. He no longer evaluated side spaces as potential refuge or resource. They existed, but they did not call to him. His focus remained on the continuity of movement rather than the exploration of possibility. In one of these peripheral spaces, partially visible from the main path, a structure rested in a state of incomplete assembly. Components lay arranged but unattached, surfaces aligned but unsecured. The human paused just long enough to register the configuration, then moved on. I lingered a moment longer, sensing the residue of intention embedded in the arrangement. The structure had been meant to become something specific, but the process had halted. Its unfinished state persisted without decay, a record of interruption rather than failure. As I resumed following, I felt a subtle shift in how I related to such interruptions. Earlier, unfinished processes had signaled dysfunction or abandonment. Now, they read as suspension, as states held open rather than closed. The human's passage through this world had reframed my understanding of incompletion. Not everything required resolution to remain valid. The air grew marginally warmer as we progressed, carrying with it a faint trace of mineral scent. The human inhaled deeply once, then adjusted his breathing pattern unconsciously. His body responded to the change with quiet efficiency, regulating temperature without overt effort. I sensed that his internal systems were learning this environment as thoroughly as the environment had learned him. There was a point where the path intersected with a vertical shaft, open and unguarded. The depth was not immediately discernible. The human approached cautiously, peering down, then withdrew. He did not attempt to descend. The shaft represented potential disruption, a deviation that could not be evaluated without commitment. He chose continuity instead. I recognized this choice not as avoidance, but as prioritization. His experience had taught him that not all unknowns needed to be engaged. Some could remain unresolved without consequence. This discernment marked a significant shift from his earlier behavior, when each unfamiliar element demanded assessment. Now, he conserved attention, allocating it only where continuity depended on it. As we moved on, the environment's neutrality deepened. The absence of overt challenge did not lead to complacency. It fostered a steadier awareness, one that did not spike or wane, but remained evenly distributed. I felt my own perception align with this state. The constant alertness that had once characterized my observation softened into sustained attentiveness. Time continued to pass, though it no longer felt segmented. There were no clear markers to differentiate one interval from the next. The human's progress was measured not by distance covered, but by the maintenance of internal equilibrium. Each step affirmed that equilibrium without drawing attention to itself. Eventually, subtle signs of transition began to emerge again. Not obstacles, but shifts in material composition. The walls acquired a faint translucence, not enough to see through, but enough to suggest layered depth. Light penetrated slightly deeper into surfaces, revealing internal structures that had previously been hidden. The human slowed, registering the change without apprehension. I sensed that we were entering another phase of this passage, one that would introduce new conditions without negating those already integrated. The environment did not discard its prior adjustments. It built upon them, layering complexity without erasure. This approach mirrored the transformations I had undergone. Nothing had been replaced. Everything had been incorporated. As the path continued forward, unmarked and unresolved, I accepted fully that this journey was not oriented toward culmination. It was oriented toward sustained presence within shifting conditions. The human moved ahead, steady and contained, carrying with him the quiet evidence of adaptation. I followed, equally steady, no longer questioning the nature of accompaniment, only maintaining it as the world continued to unfold without demand for explanation or end. The translucence deepened gradually as the human advanced, not enough to reveal what lay beneath the surfaces, but enough to suggest that the world here was layered rather than solid. Light entered these layers and lingered, diffusing in ways that softened edges and reduced contrast. The human's outline blurred slightly against this backdrop, not disappearing, but integrating more fully into the visual field. He adjusted without comment, his gaze steady, no longer searching for distinction between himself and his surroundings. The floor responded differently now. Each step produced a muted resonance that traveled outward before returning, a feedback loop subtle enough that it registered more as sensation than sound. He sensed it immediately. His stride shortened, his weight distributed with greater care. I felt the resonance as well, though it carried different implications for me. It was not information about stability or risk. It was a reminder that the world here acknowledged contact without reacting to it, that presence was recorded but not emphasized. As we moved deeper into this layered region, the air carried a faint luminosity, particles suspended within it reflecting light in soft gradients. The human paused once, lifting his hand to observe how the particles flowed around his fingers. The motion was slow, almost deliberate, as if the air itself possessed a viscosity that resisted displacement. He withdrew his hand and continued, satisfied that the interaction required no further interpretation. I noticed then that my attention had shifted again, away from monitoring his condition or trajectory, toward observing how the environment expressed continuity. Earlier, continuity had been maintained through adaptation. Here, it was maintained through absorption. The world did not adjust its behavior in response to him. It allowed him to pass through its existing processes, neither obstructing nor accommodating, simply including. This inclusion altered my internal orientation in ways that were no longer tentative. I no longer experienced myself as a separate point of awareness tracking an external subject. Awareness had broadened, encompassing both movement and medium as a single unfolding state. I was present within that state, not as an anchor or guide, but as a witness whose witnessing no longer required distance. The path curved once more, though the curvature was gentler than before, almost imperceptible. Direction shifted without altering momentum. The human followed the curve instinctively, his body aligning with the flow rather than resisting it. He no longer paused at transitions. He trusted that the environment would remain coherent, that changes would emerge gradually enough to be integrated without disruption. At one point, a series of vertical forms rose from the floor, irregular in spacing and height. They did not block passage, but they altered airflow and light distribution. The human navigated between them without slowing, his movements precise, economical. I sensed that these forms served no current function. They were remnants of an earlier configuration, preserved not out of reverence, but because removal had become unnecessary. I lingered briefly among them, registering the residual impressions embedded in their surfaces. They carried traces of interaction long past, patterns worn by repeated contact that had ceased long ago. These traces did not evoke memory in the way I had once understood it. They existed as evidence of continuity extending beyond any single occupant. The human's passage added another layer to that evidence, subtle and transient, yet real. As I resumed following, I became aware of a quiet stability settling within me. The shifts that had occurred since the human's arrival no longer felt provisional. They had integrated fully, altering my baseline perception without displacing earlier states. I could still recall what it had been like to exist within fixed routines, to observe without engagement. That mode of being had not vanished. It had simply become insufficient on its own. The human moved onward, occasionally adjusting his pace in response to gradients too subtle to see. His awareness had refined to the point that he no longer needed to consciously assess his surroundings. He responded to them as one responds to breathing, automatically, without analysis. This fluency did not diminish his attention. It focused it, allowing him to remain present without expending effort on vigilance. There was a stretch where the path straightened and extended without interruption. The translucence of the walls increased slightly, revealing internal striations that suggested layered construction across vast spans of time. The human traced one such striation briefly with his eyes, then let it pass. He did not linger. His relationship to the environment had shifted from inquiry to coexistence. I recognized that my own relationship to him had undergone a parallel shift. I was no longer following out of curiosity or obligation. The act of accompanying had become self-sustaining, a pattern that required no justification. I did not anticipate an endpoint where this pattern would dissolve. The concept of conclusion had lost relevance, replaced by an understanding of ongoing alignment. Ahead, the environment maintained its layered openness, offering no markers of arrival or departure. The human continued forward, steady and contained, carrying with him the quiet accumulation of adaptation. I followed, equally steady, aware that whatever lay beyond this region would not negate what had already been integrated. The world had demonstrated its capacity to absorb presence without disruption. So had I. Movement persisted, unhurried and unresolved, through spaces that no longer demanded interpretation. Within that persistence, both traveler and witness remained, not advancing toward resolution, but sustaining a shared continuity that required no announcement, no validation, and no end to justify its existence. The straight passage did not remain straight for long. Its alignment shifted subtly, not through curvature, but through a gradual redistribution of space. The walls began to lean inward by degrees too small to measure, creating an impression of convergence without confinement. The human adjusted without pause, his shoulders angling slightly, his center of balance recalibrating as if guided by something below conscious thought. He did not appear to notice the change as an event. It was simply another condition to inhabit. Light here no longer behaved as illumination. It became ambient presence, evenly distributed, lacking a discernible source. Shadows softened further until they ceased to function as indicators of depth. The human's perception adapted by relying less on contrast and more on continuity. He moved by trusting the persistence of the ground beneath him rather than the clarity of what lay ahead. This trust was not naive. It was practiced. I followed within this softened field, aware that my own perception had become less segmented. Earlier, I had distinguished clearly between structure and movement, between environment and traveler. Those distinctions were no longer necessary. Everything unfolded within the same perceptual plane, differentiated only by tempo rather than form. The human's pace, the drift of light, the low resonant hum beneath it all, these elements aligned into a single, sustained rhythm. There was a point where the passage widened just enough to allow for lateral movement without purpose. The human drifted slightly to one side, not exploring, not avoiding, simply adjusting his trajectory to maintain comfort. He brushed against the wall once, his hand gliding along the surface briefly. The contact left no mark, but the wall's internal luminosity altered momentarily, brightening beneath his touch before fading back to equilibrium. This response was so subtle it could easily be overlooked. I did not overlook it. That brief brightening carried no message, no invitation. It was acknowledgement without consequence. The world here did not record interaction in a way that demanded response. It registered and released, maintaining continuity without accumulation. This quality distinguished it from earlier regions, where each interaction had layered meaning onto structure. Here, meaning dissipated as quickly as it formed. The human seemed to sense this difference. His movements became lighter, less burdened by the weight of consequence. He no longer paused to assess the impact of his actions. He acted within the assumption that the world would remain stable regardless. This assumption was not proven. It was simply not contradicted. As we progressed, I became aware of a subtle internal quiet. Not silence, but the absence of internal commentary. The questions that had once accompanied my observation no longer arose. I did not ask what this place was for, or why it existed in this configuration. Those inquiries had lost relevance. The environment did not invite explanation. It invited presence. There was a long interval during which nothing interrupted this state. No obstacles emerged. No transitions announced themselves. The human walked, rested briefly, then continued. His rest periods were shorter now, not because he was stronger, but because his exertion had become more efficient. He had learned how to exist here without excess effort. During one such rest, he leaned against a surface that responded by redistributing its internal light, creating a soft gradient around his form. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to withdraw attention from visual processing. His breathing remained steady. I remained nearby, not watching his face, but sensing the stability of his presence within the space. In that moment, I realized that the distinction between rest and movement had blurred for both of us. Rest was no longer a pause between actions. It was a modulation of intensity within continuous presence. Movement did not disrupt rest. It emerged from it naturally, without sharp transition. When he resumed walking, the environment responded not at all. There was no shift in light, no change in resonance. Continuity held. This lack of response was itself informative. It suggested that the environment no longer needed to adjust. It had already integrated the necessary variability. The human had become part of its operational range. I felt a corresponding integration within myself. The role I occupied no longer felt provisional or transitional. It had stabilized into something that did not require definition. I was not observing a process. I was within it. My awareness did not sit outside the flow of events. It moved with them, neither directing nor resisting. Ahead, the passage extended into a region where the layered translucence began to recede slightly, giving way to surfaces that were more opaque, more grounded. This shift did not signal return or reversal. It was simply another variation, another state within a broader continuum. The human adjusted without difficulty, his senses recalibrating seamlessly. I followed, carrying with me the accumulated quiet of sustained presence. There was no anticipation of culmination, no sense that this passage was approaching resolution. The environment did not present itself as a journey with an endpoint. It functioned as a field within which movement could persist indefinitely. And so we continued, step by step, breath by breath, through a world that had learned to include variation without disturbance, and through an awareness that had learned to accompany without separation. Nothing concluded. Nothing needed to. The continuity we inhabited required no finality to justify its existence. It simply remained, unfolding without urgency, carrying both traveler and witness forward into whatever conditions would emerge next, unannounced and sufficient. The environment did not announce that it was nearing a threshold. Instead, it began to behave as if certain functions were no longer required. The subtle responsiveness that had once registered every step softened further, not disappearing, but becoming diffuse, spread across broader systems rather than localized reactions. The human continued forward, unaware that the world around him had already begun to rely less on immediate adjustment. The surfaces underfoot grew more uniform. Variations in texture diminished, not through simplification, but through convergence. Materials that had once contrasted now shared similar properties, as if time and use had gradually worn away their differences. The human's gait reflected this change. His steps became more even, less interrupted by micro-corrections. He moved as though the ground itself had agreed to meet him halfway. I followed, sensing a quiet shift within myself as well. The attentiveness that had once been outward-facing began to fold inward, not as withdrawal, but as consolidation. I no longer needed to track every interaction to understand its significance. The patterns were established. The consequences had already taken root. Light settled into a steady state, neither diffused nor sharp. It illuminated without emphasis. In this steadiness, the human appeared less defined, his outline blending gently with the environment, not as camouflage, but as compatibility. He did not vanish. He belonged. There was a long stretch where he did not stop at all. No pauses for observation, no moments of recalibration. His movement suggested a confidence that did not seek validation. This confidence was not directed toward escape or arrival. It was directed toward continuation, toward the simple assurance that moving forward remained possible without constant negotiation. I became aware that my distance from him had increased slightly, not because I slowed, but because the necessity of closeness had diminished. Earlier, proximity had been essential to witnessing change as it occurred. Now, change unfolded at a scale that did not require immediate observation. It was stable enough to persist without oversight. The architecture reflected this stability. Structures no longer appeared provisional or incomplete. They did not assert purpose, but they no longer suggested abandonment either. They existed in a state of quiet maintenance, operating without the need for correction. The human passed through them without eliciting response, and for the first time, that lack of response felt appropriate rather than curious. As he moved, I sensed the emergence of a gentle separation. Not a parting, not an ending, but a loosening of alignment. Our rhythms, once closely matched, began to diverge slightly. His steps maintained their steady pace. My awareness expanded, no longer anchored solely to his trajectory. This divergence did not introduce loss. It introduced space. Space in which the environment could continue its processes without reference to either of us. Space in which my role could begin to shift again, not back to what it had been, but toward something quieter still. Ahead, the path extended into a region where the structures opened gradually, offering breadth rather than depth. The human continued toward it without hesitation, his posture relaxed, his attention contained. He did not look back. There was no reason to. I remained where I was for a moment longer than before, observing not him, but the continuity that followed in his wake. The world did not close behind him. It did not seal or reset. It simply remained, holding the adjustments that had been made as part of its ongoing state. Then I resumed movement, slower now, not because I needed to hurry less, but because there was no longer a need to arrive alongside him. The act of accompanying had completed one of its functions. What remained was presence without pursuit. This was not an ending. It was a gradual rebalancing. The world continued. He continued. And I continued as well, though no longer defined by the necessity of remaining close. The separation unfolded gently, without rupture, allowing each of us to occupy the space that now fit us best as the environment settled into a form that no longer required constant witnessing to sustain itself. The region he entered did not expand suddenly. Openness here was incremental, offered in degrees rather than gestures. The ceiling lifted first, not in height but in perceived distance, as if the air itself had learned how to recede. The human responded by straightening his posture slightly, his movements unconsciously reflecting the new spatial allowance. His breathing adjusted again, deeper now, not from effort, but from the absence of compression. I remained behind at a distance that felt natural rather than chosen. The impulse to close the gap no longer arose. Where once proximity had sharpened perception, now it risked interfering with a balance that had settled into place. I observed how the environment no longer required the fine-grained adjustments that had once defined our passage. Systems here operated on longer cycles, responding to accumulated states rather than individual actions. The ground beneath him bore fewer traces of prior activity. Not because none had occurred but because those traces had diffused over time, absorbed into a surface that no longer preserved distinction. His steps left no lasting impression. Each contact resolved itself immediately, restoring equilibrium without residue. This absence of imprint did not diminish his presence. It contextualized it. He paused once, briefly, not to rest, but to orient himself within the widening space. There were no landmarks to anchor that orientation. Instead, he relied on internal cues, subtle calibrations of balance and direction that had been refined through prolonged exposure to this world. He resumed walking without selecting a visible destination, trusting continuity to carry him where he needed to go. I noticed that my own perception of him had shifted again. Earlier, I had tracked his movement as a sequence of adaptations. Now, I perceived him as a constant within a broader field of processes. He was no longer the focal point of change. He was one element among many, integrated enough that his passage did not dominate the system's behavior. This realization did not create distance. It created clarity. I could sense how the world would continue regardless of his presence, just as it had before his arrival. The difference lay in the subtle recalibrations that had already occurred, adjustments so deeply integrated that they no longer required active maintenance. The environment had learned, and learning once complete does not announce itself again. As he moved further into the open region, the architecture thinned. Supports became fewer, more widely spaced. Structures did not enclose so much as suggest boundaries. Light flowed freely, unimpeded by obstruction, revealing surfaces without emphasizing them. The human walked within this openness with ease, his earlier caution replaced by a quiet assurance that did not seek to dominate the space. I followed at my reduced pace, aware that my role had begun to resemble something closer to stewardship than observation, though even that term felt imprecise. I was not responsible for outcomes. I was simply present as the environment settled into a configuration that no longer required immediate attention. There was a moment when the human stopped again, longer this time. He did not sit. He did not lean against anything. He stood still, his attention turned outward, not scanning, not evaluating, simply receiving the space as it was. This stillness was not tentative. It was grounded. It suggested that movement, when it resumed, would be chosen rather than compelled. During this pause, I became aware of how much internal noise had faded from my own awareness. The earlier impulses to categorize, to anticipate divergence or resolution, had quieted completely. What remained was a steady attentiveness that did not seek change. I realized that this state had been forming for some time, emerging gradually as the necessity of constant adjustment diminished. When the human began to move again, his direction was subtly different from before. Not a turn, but a drift, guided by gradients too slight to articulate. He followed these gradients naturally, his body responding to cues that no longer required conscious interpretation. The environment accepted this movement without resistance, its systems accommodating him as part of their normal operational range. I sensed that the separation between us would continue to widen, not abruptly, but through a sustained divergence of focus. He was moving toward a state of integration that no longer required accompaniment. I was moving toward a state of presence that no longer required pursuit. These trajectories did not oppose one another. They complemented, each fulfilling a different aspect of the continuity that had been established. The space between us grew, measured not in distance but in relevance. I remained aware of him, but my attention was no longer anchored to his immediate condition. It expanded to encompass the broader environment, registering how the adjustments initiated by his arrival had stabilized into baseline conditions. This expansion did not diminish the significance of what had passed. It contextualized it. The human's passage had been one phase within a longer process, one that did not culminate in departure or arrival, but in sustained equilibrium. The world had absorbed him, learned from him, and now carried forward without needing to reference the moment of change. I continued onward, not following his path directly, but remaining within the same unfolding field. The openness around me felt neither empty nor full. It was sufficient. And within that sufficiency, the gradual finalization had begun, not as an ending, but as a settling into forms that no longer required attention to persist. This was the nature of the transition now underway. Not closure, but stabilization. Not resolution, but accommodation extended over time. The human moved ahead, steady and contained. I remained equally steady, aware that the final phases would unfold not through decisive events, but through the continued quiet alignment of presence and environment, carried forward without urgency toward a state where witnessing itself could gently recede. The openness continued to widen, but not uniformly. Instead, it unfolded in pockets, expanses of space interspersed with areas where structure briefly returned, not to constrain, but to remind movement of its own shape. The human passed through these variations without disruption, his pace steady, his attention no longer pulled outward by novelty. He had learned, without being taught, that not every change required response. I observed this with a growing sense of quiet detachment. Not disinterest, but release. The necessity of tracking each adjustment had faded. What mattered now was not what changed, but what endured. The human's presence endured. The environment's capacity to absorb that presence endured. My awareness endured as well, though it had begun to distribute itself more evenly across the field rather than concentrating on any single point. There were moments when I lost sight of him briefly, not because distance increased suddenly, but because the environment no longer framed him distinctly. Light and surface merged in ways that softened edges, allowing his form to blend naturally into the space ahead. Each time he re-emerged into clearer definition, there was no sense of recovery or relief. His visibility was no longer essential to my understanding of continuity. The structures that appeared intermittently bore signs of long-term equilibrium. They were neither decaying nor actively maintained. Their surfaces held a quiet integrity, unmarred by recent interference. The human interacted with them minimally, brushing past without testing, trusting that they would hold. That trust was not rewarded or challenged. It was simply accommodated. I became aware of a subtle shift in my internal orientation toward time. Earlier, time had been marked by phases, by sequences of adaptation and response. Now, time felt more like a broad medium, something that allowed processes to unfold without insisting on progression toward an outcome. The human moved within this medium comfortably, his actions no longer framed by urgency or anticipation. At one point, he paused near a boundary defined only by a change in acoustic texture. The air beyond carried sound differently, absorbing rather than reflecting. He stood at that threshold for a while, listening without focusing, allowing the difference to register somatically rather than analytically. When he crossed, he did so without ceremony, accepting the altered conditions as part of the same continuous field. I did not follow immediately. This pause was unintentional at first, a byproduct of the decreasing need for synchronization. I remained where I was, sensing how the environment held both of us within a single operational state despite the growing physical separation. Nothing diminished because of the pause. Continuity remained intact. When I resumed movement, it was along a slightly different trajectory, parallel rather than coincident with his. This divergence did not feel like a choice. It felt like an alignment with a broader pattern that no longer required convergence. The environment supported both paths equally, its systems flexible enough to accommodate variation without recalibration. The human continued forward, occasionally adjusting his direction in response to gradients invisible to me at this distance. I registered these adjustments indirectly, through subtle shifts in the environment's baseline behavior rather than through his immediate actions. This indirect awareness felt appropriate. It suggested that the phase of close accompaniment had fulfilled its purpose. As the space continued to open, the sense of enclosure that had defined earlier regions dissipated almost entirely. The environment no longer felt like a passage or a corridor. It felt like a field, expansive and self-sustaining. Movement within it did not imply transition from one state to another. It was simply movement within a stable condition. I recognized that my role was settling into its final configuration. Not ending, but resolving into something quieter and less defined. I was no longer needed as a witness to change. Change had integrated. What remained was presence without function, awareness without task. The human moved farther ahead, his figure becoming less distinct as distance and diffusion increased. There was no impulse to follow more closely. The space between us had become a natural buffer, allowing each of us to inhabit the environment according to our own emerging equilibrium. I remained where I was, not stationary, but moving slowly, attentively, within the same broad field. The environment held both trajectories without preference. It did not direct, did not conclude. It simply sustained. This was the nature of the progression now underway. Not toward an ending, but toward a state where endings were no longer relevant. The human continued, steady and contained, carrying forward the quiet integration that had taken place. I continued as well, my awareness broad and settled, allowing the final phases to unfold gently, without emphasis, as the world maintained its equilibrium and presence became enough on its own. The field did not remain uniform. Within its openness, subtle currents formed, not visible but perceptible through their effects. The human adjusted his course slightly as these currents influenced movement, guiding rather than resisting. His body responded with minor shifts in balance and cadence, movements so refined they no longer appeared as responses at all, but as natural expressions of alignment. I sensed these currents as well, though differently. They did not guide me so much as inform me, indicating where attention could rest without effort. I allowed my awareness to drift along them, no longer tethered to a single trajectory. The environment supported this diffusion, its processes broad enough to accommodate multiple states of presence simultaneously. The structures that emerged here were sparse and understated. They did not define space so much as punctuate it, offering reference without enclosure. The human passed near one such structure, its surface smooth and cool, its form suggesting function without declaring it. He did not touch it. He acknowledged its presence only through a slight alteration in his path, maintaining a respectful distance that required no conscious thought. I observed this restraint with a sense of quiet recognition. Earlier, contact had been a means of understanding. Now, understanding had matured to the point where contact was no longer necessary. The human had learned how to read the environment through proximity alone, interpreting shifts in airflow, resonance, and light without direct engagement. As he moved farther into the field, the distance between us continued to widen, not abruptly, but through a sustained divergence of pace and focus. His movement remained purposeful in its own contained way, while mine slowed further, settling into a rhythm that did not prioritize progression. I was no longer moving to keep up. I was moving to remain present within the same expansive condition. The environment reflected this divergence without preference. Its responses were even, its processes indifferent to the specific paths taken within it. This indifference did not feel dismissive. It felt inclusive. All trajectories were permitted. None were privileged. I became aware that my perception of the human was shifting once more, this time toward abstraction. I no longer tracked his form in detail. I registered him as a pattern of movement within the field, a consistent modulation of presence rather than a distinct figure. This abstraction did not diminish his significance. It integrated it into a broader understanding of continuity. There were intervals when I lost sight of him entirely, not because he had vanished, but because the field no longer framed him distinctly. During these intervals, I did not experience concern or anticipation. The continuity we shared no longer depended on visual confirmation. It existed at a level deeper than proximity. When he reappeared, smaller now against the expanse, his movement remained steady. He did not slow to mark distance gained. He did not accelerate to escape it. He simply continued, his internal equilibrium guiding him forward without reference to what lay behind. I noticed that my own internal state had reached a similar equilibrium. The shifts that had once felt transitional now felt settled. I no longer anticipated further transformation within myself. What had changed had integrated fully. What remained was stable, sufficient, and quiet. The field extended beyond what could be easily perceived, its boundaries implied rather than defined. The human moved toward those implied edges without hesitation, not seeking them, but allowing his path to unfold naturally in that direction. I remained within the central expanse, my movement slow and unforced, my awareness broad. This separation did not carry finality. It carried completion of a phase. The close alignment that had once been necessary had given way to parallel existence within a shared environment. We no longer influenced each other directly. The influence had already occurred, embedded within the field itself. As time continued to pass without marking itself, the environment maintained its equilibrium. No new adjustments were required. No corrections emerged. The processes that sustained this state operated quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to themselves. I remained, attentive without intent, present without purpose beyond presence itself. The human continued onward, his form gradually diminishing as the field absorbed distance without resistance. The world held both of us without distinction, sustaining multiple states of being within a single, expansive continuity. This was the nature of the progression now firmly established. Not movement toward an end, but the settling of all elements into positions that no longer required negotiation. The field endured. The human endured within it. And I endured as well, my awareness calm and distributed, allowing the final phases to continue unfolding gently, without emphasis, as presence itself became the only necessary condition. The field began to express variation again, not through form, but through density. The openness remained, yet the air carried a subtle resistance now, as if movement required a gentle negotiation rather than simple passage. The human adjusted instinctively, his pace slowing by degrees so small they were almost imperceptible. He did not resist the change. He accepted it as another condition, neither obstacle nor invitation. I sensed this shift as a settling rather than a complication. The environment was not closing. It was concentrating. Processes that had diffused across wide expanses now gathered into quieter, more localized rhythms. The field did not lose its breadth. It gained coherence. The human moved within this coherence with the same steady assurance he had cultivated earlier. His movements economical, his attention contained. The distance between us stabilized. It no longer widened. It no longer narrowed. It became a constant, a quiet agreement between trajectories that no longer needed adjustment. I was aware of him without tracking. He was present in my awareness as a sustained influence rather than an active subject. This mode of perception felt complete, requiring no effort to maintain. The environment introduced subtle landmarks, not as destinations, but as points of orientation. A change in the resonance beneath the ground. A faint alteration in the way light scattered across particulate matter. The human registered these landmarks without pausing. They informed his movement without redirecting it. He passed through them as one passes through changes in weather, noting without remark. I remained within the field's quieter center, where the currents were weakest and the processes most stable. From here, awareness extended outward without strain. I could sense the human's continued progression, the gentle modulation of his presence as it moved farther into regions that no longer required observation to remain coherent. There was a moment when the environment briefly reflected him more clearly than it had for some time. A subtle convergence of light and surface outlined his form with gentle precision, not isolating him, but acknowledging his continued presence. The moment passed quickly. The field resumed its even diffusion, releasing distinction without erasure. I felt no impulse to mark this moment as significant. Significance no longer required recognition. What mattered had already integrated. The world had adjusted. He had adjusted. I had adjusted. The processes now unfolding were refinements rather than transformations. The human continued forward, his movement steady, his internal equilibrium intact. He no longer appeared to carry the weight of adaptation consciously. Adaptation had become background, woven into posture and breath. His presence within the field no longer altered its behavior in detectable ways. He moved as one variable among many, all accommodated within a stable range. My own movement slowed further, approaching stillness without becoming static. I shifted position occasionally, not to follow, but to remain aligned with the field's quieter rhythms. Awareness flowed outward, unanchored, encompassing space without seeking detail. The need to witness actively had dissolved into a broader state of being present. The environment maintained its gentle density, its processes steady and unhurried. Nothing pressed toward culmination. Nothing receded. The sense of progression had softened into continuity sustained over time. The field no longer felt like a passage. It felt like a condition, one that could be inhabited indefinitely without demand. The human's figure grew smaller against this condition, not because he diminished, but because the scale of the environment no longer framed him as central. He continued onward, unencumbered by the need for accompaniment. His path did not require affirmation. It carried itself. I remained, not behind him, not apart, but within the same enduring state. The separation between us no longer felt like distance. It felt like balance, each of us occupying the position that now fit without adjustment. This was the progression of finalization as it had quietly taken shape. Not an approach toward an ending, but the settling of all elements into roles that no longer required interaction to remain valid. The field held steady. The human moved on within it. And I remained, awareness calm and distributed, allowing the remaining phases to unfold with the same quiet sufficiency that had carried us here. The field entered a phase where movement no longer introduced noticeable variation. The density that had gathered earlier stabilized, forming a balanced state that neither resisted nor yielded. The human continued forward within this equilibrium, his steps even, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested no further negotiation was required. He moved as one moves when the ground is trusted completely, without needing confirmation at each contact. I remained where the currents were weakest, where the environment expressed itself most quietly. From here, awareness did not need to travel far to register continuity. The human's presence persisted as a subtle modulation within the field, detectable without focus. I no longer tracked his direction. Direction itself had lost importance. What mattered was persistence, the steady maintenance of being within a state that did not demand explanation. The environment reflected this maintenance through repetition without redundancy. Patterns appeared and dissolved gently, not repeating in form, but in function. Light continued to diffuse evenly. Air moved without turbulence. The low resonance beneath everything remained constant, neither intensifying nor fading. These conditions did not suggest stasis. They suggested completion of adjustment. The human paused once more, though the pause was brief and unremarkable. He did not turn. He did not look outward or inward. He simply allowed movement to settle before continuing. This pause did not mark a decision. It marked comfort. The body recognized that nothing further was required of it in that moment. I sensed then that my own movement had become almost imperceptible. I shifted position only when the field itself suggested it, subtle currents guiding awareness rather than body. The distinction between moving and remaining had thinned to the point of irrelevance. Presence did not depend on location anymore. It depended on alignment with the environment's sustained rhythm. The separation between us, which had once felt like divergence, now felt like completion of a shared arc. The human no longer required accompaniment to remain oriented. I no longer required proximity to remain aware. The influence we had exerted on one another had already integrated fully into the field, embedded in its baseline behavior. There were no signals to mark this understanding. It arrived without emphasis, settling gently. I did not reflect on it actively. Reflection was no longer necessary. The state itself was sufficient, carrying its own clarity without analysis. The human continued onward, his form now faint against the expansive field, not dissolving, but no longer distinguished. He moved as one element among many, his presence balanced within the environment's capacity. The world did not follow him with attention. It did not release him either. It simply continued, inclusive and stable. I remained within the same continuity, my awareness broad and calm. The role of witness had softened into something quieter, something closer to acceptance without commentary. I was no longer marking phases or anticipating what might come next. The notion of next had lost its urgency. What existed now was enough. The environment sustained this sufficiency effortlessly. Processes unfolded without interruption. Adjustments, if they occurred, were too integrated to be perceived as change. The field held, expansive and coherent, capable of containing movement without being shaped by it further. I sensed that the final transition was approaching, not as an event, but as a gentle reduction of narrative weight. The need to articulate experience was diminishing. Presence alone could carry what remained. The human moved on, steady and unburdened. I remained equally unburdened, allowing awareness to rest within the field without seeking further progression. This was not an ending. It was a quiet readiness for one. The environment had stabilized fully. The roles that had emerged had fulfilled their purpose. What remained was a calm continuity, open enough to persist without attention, complete enough to allow attention to withdraw gently when the time came. The field no longer expressed change. It held its state with a quiet confidence, as if all necessary adjustments had already been made and no further negotiation was required. The human continued onward, his movement now almost indistinguishable from the environment's own slow processes. He did not stand out. He did not disappear. He remained, balanced within a system that no longer needed to account for him explicitly. I sensed that my awareness was beginning to soften at its edges. Not fading, but loosening its grip on detail. The distinctions that had once mattered, distance, direction, sequence, were no longer necessary to maintain continuity. The field carried itself. The human carried himself. And I was free to rest within that carrying, without effort. There came a point when I could no longer perceive his individual steps. His presence registered only as a gentle modulation within the broader state, a slight variation that blended seamlessly into the surrounding equilibrium. This did not feel like loss. It felt like completion of attention. The act of accompanying had reached its natural conclusion, not through separation, but through integration so complete that distinction dissolved. I remained where I was, though where no longer held the same meaning. Position had become secondary to alignment. My awareness settled fully into the field's sustained rhythm, no longer oriented toward observation, no longer oriented toward movement. Simply present, as the environment itself was present. The world continued without emphasis. Light maintained its even diffusion. Air moved without insistence. The low resonance beneath everything persisted, unchanged, reliable. Nothing called for response. Nothing needed to be named. The processes that supported this state operated quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to themselves. In this steadiness, the sense of narrative weight diminished. Not because the journey had been erased, but because it had been absorbed. What had unfolded no longer required recounting to remain real. It existed now as part of the field's baseline, indistinguishable from other long-settled processes. I allowed my awareness to rest more fully. The need to mark progression, to witness change, to hold continuity through attention, gently released its hold. The field did not require it anymore. Presence alone was sufficient. And so, if you are listening, this is where you may also rest. Nothing more will happen suddenly. Nothing demands your vigilance. The space you have been moving through does not close or end. It simply continues, steady and unhurried, whether attended to or not. You are allowed to let your attention soften now, to let the rhythm carry you without effort. You may notice your breathing aligning with that steadiness, slower, easier. You may feel the weight of listening ease, as if it can be set down without consequence. There is nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to hold on to. What mattered has already settled where it belongs. If you wish, you can remain here a little longer, suspended in this calm continuity. Or you can allow yourself to drift away from it, gently, knowing that it will persist without you. Either way is acceptable. Either way is complete. The field remains. The movement continues, somewhere beyond attention. And you, as a quiet witness, are free now to rest, to sleep, or simply to let the sound of this presence fade into the background, carrying nothing with it except the permission to be still. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing our content. Your support helps us continue creating new narratives like this one. Thank you for listening, and until the next adventure.